Good afternoon. It's almost good afternoon, so maybe I need a response from you. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2024 Chertok Professor Lecture Series. This is in honor of Dean Jeffers W. Chertok, who was a Dean of Social Sciences at Eastern Washington University for 3 decades. This professorship was established to honor his legacy, particularly how he made significant contributions to scholarship, generosity, and care at the university. He was an exemplary leader, and some of his friends are in here today. So every year we invite scholars and practitioners who represent the legacy of Dean Chertok. This year's first speaker is Dr. Mark Finney, a prominent community leader in the true sense of the term. Dr. Finney is an executive director of Thrive International, an organization based in Spokane, Washington. The organization is dedicated to empowering multicultural communities, particularly immigrants and refugees. As you can think that I am an immigrant, so Dr. Finney founded Thrive International in February 2022 to help every immigrant in Spokane flourish. I really like the word thrive, and I looked at the vocabulary. What does thrive mean? It is the most powerful, succeed, prosper, boom, bloom, and I was really impressed that we have him with us today. At Thrive International, Dr. Finney has been instrumental in providing essential services to thousands of refugees in Spokane, who will be doctors, professors, teachers, and so forth in the near future and make this country great. The organization has notably responded to the influx of Ukrainian families and others following the war, offering housing and support to those in need. Under his leadership, Thrive has become a vital resource for building affordable housing and a library very soon, and fostering community integration for immigrants. That's the kind of organization we really, really need. And Dr. Finney has a philosophy caters around compassion and empowerment. He believes viewing refugees as contributors rather than burdens is crucial for fostering a welcoming environment. And if you really step to Thrive International on Friday, any day, you will really see that American dream, the passion, you will really be impressed. It's the most welcoming place. And his work reflects his faith-based commitment to caring for others, promoting dignity with underserved communities and vulnerable communities. In summary, Mr. Mark Finney leadership at Thrive International exemplifies a dedicated effort to uplift immigrants and refugee communities through practical support, advocacy, and community engagement. Please welcome Dr. Finney as he takes the stage and shares his experiences. Let's show our appreciation with a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks, Gats. I appreciate it. Well, it's an honor to be here, and I want to say thanks to all of you for showing up. I'm not sure what we were competing with outside that got rained out and sent everybody in here, but appreciate you all being present. The working thesis here is that even though it sounds like this huge issue, migration is something that we have to own at a local and even at an individual level if it's going to be something that we see changed or transformed. It can't be somebody else's problem or something a government fixes because it involves folks that are deeply impacted on a personal level, including probably many of us in this room. So here's where we're going today. I want to do a little bit of, not quite show and tell, but I want to demonstrate the point that I'm trying to make by making it personal. And so I'm going to walk through in this lecture and give you some ways to think about immigration that include sort of the global context of what immigration is like right now, how many people are moving around the world. I want to talk a little bit about the role of government in immigration, because that is an important factor in how we understand and think about and respond to immigration. And I want to share a little bit of my own experience with immigration. And then we'll end with talking about some specific ways that local communities are vital in engaging with a massive movement of humanity that's happening around the world right now. But interspersed in there, I just want to share a few stories, because this is what turns the sort of, when I say immigrant, everybody's got some sort of generic avatar that pops into your head of what an immigrant is, or maybe what you imagine all immigrants to be like en masse. But what I've found in the last 8 years since I've been leading the community here and working with immigrants is that the uniqueness of each person's story is really where the challenges and the beauty emerges. So I'm going to start by sharing a story, and then we'll get into the rest of the lecture. But I want to talk to you, I've changed all the names so they're not people's authentic actual names, but we'll call these two people Valery and Boris. And true story, different names, but these are folks that I've met just in the last few months because they had a really challenging immigration story. They are from Ukraine, and they, at the time the war broke out a couple of years ago, they were actually in Russia, in Siberia, visiting Valery's family. And once the war started, there was no returning back to Ukraine. And so what happened is they were trying to figure out what to do, and the Russian government and the authorities noticed that he was an outsider, and they started putting pressure on him to go enlist in the Russian army, because they felt like that would be a safer place for him to be for their society, and they weren't sure they trusted him. So they eventually had to move away from their family. They tried to get out of Russia. Initially, they went to Belarus, a neighboring country, but also very much under Russian control. And the secret police found them there also very quickly, and he started to feel like he was going to be forced into the military there as well. They tried to get into Poland, a neighboring country, but they were not allowed to cross the border. So instead, they found that they could get a visa if they went back to Moscow to go to Montenegro. I don't even know where that is, or I didn't even know about it until they told me about it. So I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Montenegro. Okay. Oh, yes, in the back. I needed to bring some candy and throw some candy. So they end up in Montenegro. Now, there are Ukrainian citizens, but she was born in Russia, so her passport is Russian. They applied to come to the United States because Montenegro is not a big country. They don't have an economic opportunity for this family to sustain themselves. It's mom, dad, and 3 little sons. So what happens is they end up applying to go to the U.S. through a sponsor in Spokane who knew them, part of a church community here of Slavic folks. And dad and the 3 sons, their visas get approved, but mom's is still pending. So dad says, okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go to Spokane, get a job, find housing, and start working, and then when your stuff gets approved, you can come join me. So he comes here, he starts working, he's paying his rent here, and he's also paying for their rent for their place back in Montenegro, so money's tight, but they're making it work. Well, it goes on like this for about 5 months, and then the 6-month travel visas that they have are about to expire for the kids. So dad and mom have this tough conversation, and they decide, okay, dad's going to fly back to Montenegro, take the 3 kids, bring them to the United States, and hope that mom's visa comes through in time for her to travel too. Now, the other wrinkle in the story is that right before dad left, mom is pregnant. So dad goes back, gets the kids, comes to the United States, leaves mom behind, who is now at this point 6 or 7 months pregnant, and they're all hoping that the visa comes before the baby does, because if the baby's born, the baby doesn't have travel documentations, and they got to start the whole process over with the baby whose parents are Ukrainian, whose mom's from Russia, and who's born in Montenegro. So I heard about this about 6 weeks ago from a staff member in my office who's working with the dad. And we were able to do some advocacy work with some folks that we know in the U.S. government. They were able to facilitate an expedited approval of her pending visa. And she showed up in Spokane Airport about 4 weeks ago. And I got to be there. It was very special. But she came out, and her kids were there, and her husband were there, and her belly was there. And she's due any day. But it was very close. She flew at 35 and a half weeks, and if you hit 36 weeks, the airlines won't let you on an airplane. So that's one very small example about how migration is not a generic situation. And also for how, one of the reasons I love working with immigrants is because you get to connect with incredible stories. So here's my experience of working with immigrants. Long story before this, but I ended up needing to find a job in 2016. And I had recently moved back with my family to Spokane from living in California for a while, but grew up in this area. And was looking for a job and found a job at a refugee resettlement agency. Now there's 2 agencies in Spokane that resettle refugees. One's called World Relief, the other's International Rescue Committee. And I got a job working at World Relief as a refugee resettlement specialist, which is basically a social worker for refugees. And according to the Refugee Resettlement Program, it's one specific avenue for immigration into the country. People are approved ahead of time. It takes usually 2 to 10 years to go through background checks and medical processing and cultural training and things like that. But once they're approved to come here, then the government has a contract with agencies, including the one I worked at, where for 90 days you get a social worker to help you. I don't know if anybody's ever studied abroad or been in another country for more than 90 days. I lived in Thailand for a year. 90 days is not a very long time if you come to a new culture and you don't speak the language to have social services support. But I got to be part of a team of folks that was helping people for 90 days. And I worked with people from all over the world, from Myanmar and Ethiopia and Russia and Sub-Saharan Africa, several different places like Sudan and the Congo and all over the place. It was super interesting and super engaging, but also very, very challenging. So I did that for a while. After about a year, I became the director of World Relief's office. Actually, at the very beginning of the last Trump administration, there was some intense policies that banned refugees. And that's when I became the director of the office here in Spokane. So I led that office for about 5 years, from February 2017 to 2022. During that time, we helped about 1,000 new refugees come to this area from dozens of countries. And an additional couple of thousand immigrants in the area who'd been here longer, we helped serve them with various services. I left World Relief in February of 2022 because I wanted to pursue a vision that was more than just social services. The 90 days kind of rubbed me wrong because my favorite thing was the stories of people who go on to start businesses and buy homes and send their kids to university and live the American dream. And a lot of the social services I experienced that's government funded is more targeted on sort of self-sufficiency and basic needs, which are important. But I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could do an organization that didn't just help people survive, but really kind of nudge them on that path to thriving? So hence Thrive International. And then just so happened that I started this thing 3 weeks before the Ukraine war happened. And I didn't anticipate it growing as fast as it did, but from starting with an iPad in my daughter's bedroom on a folding table to having a 100-room, 100,000 square foot hotel in downtown Spokane took 4 months. So that was not part of my business plan. It just happened that we created a new model right at the time where a new crisis hit, and we ended up with hundreds of Ukrainian families in Spokane. They couldn't get served through the other agencies because they didn't fit the right immigration status. They're humanitarian parolees. They're not refugees in the strict sense. So that happened, and then that was a little less than 3 years ago. And then a year ago, King County, which is the county where Seattle is, called and said, we've got a situation with a bunch of Venezuelans and Angolans who've come to the United States seeking asylum, another immigration pathway. Most of them crossed the southern border and engaged with Border Patrol and asked to be able to stay. So they're waiting for court hearings. But they can't work because there's a 6-month bar on employment for people who come through that immigration channel. So these folks were camped out in this big tent encampment next to a church in Tukwila, not too far from the Seattle airport. And so King County called and said, hey, would you come over and do a housing program like you're doing in Spokane, but in Seattle? So now we have another facility and a program over there that houses about 100 families there and 100 families here. And we're working on more sustainable housing. So in partnership with the Public Library of the City of Spokane, we're developing 1.5 acres of land in North Spokane to build 48 apartments and a community center that'll be more long-term housing. So those are some of the things that we do. There's our website on the brochure, or I've got business cards if you want to learn more. We do work with volunteers, and we can talk more about that later. I'm going to try to give you all some time for questions as well. But that's my background. That's how I got into this stuff. Let me tell you another story. I want to tell you about a guy who I'm going to say his name is Muhammad. And I met Muhammad when I was in that first role as a refugee resettlement specialist, a social worker. And Muhammad came here not as a refugee, but on a special immigrant visa, which is a unique program that the United States created for people from Iraq and Afghanistan who served with our military. And because of that service with our military, their lives were endangered, or their families' lives were endangered. So I met Muhammad when he and his wife and his 4 kids were arriving on an airplane, and just really connected with him. And so, as often happens, I'm trying to help them get settled, and within a few days, they're offering me hospitality and invite me and my family to come over to their house for dinner. So we went and we sat on their floor, because Afghans don't use tables and chairs. There's a lot of, sitting on the floor. And so we had a great time sitting on the floor with our kids and them. And his English was great because he'd worked with the U.S. military. And so we just developed this bond, and we've shared a number of meals and holidays with them over time. But here's his story. So shortly after the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001 or 2, whenever that was, he signed up with the Afghan military to help the United States Army. And so he spent about 10 years working closely with U.S. troops. And by the time he was done, he was a commander of an entire unit of Afghan special forces that worked closely with the United States in tandem to fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So eventually, as he grew in his rank in the military, he became a more high-profile target, to the point where his family was no longer safe in the country. So he applied for a special immigrant visa, now is in Spokane. Fast forward about 5 years, and we all remember a few years ago when the United States pulled our troops out of Afghanistan, and it didn't go very well, and we ended up with sort of the collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban overrunning the country. And then we've got this mess where we've got thousands of U.S. troops and hundreds of thousands of our allies who are trying to get out through the airport in a period of 2 weeks. During that time, my friend Muhammad, his family was still over there. Many of them were also in the military. 3 of his brothers were part of that operation, where they were Afghan military, and they were inside the airport, guarding the walls in many cases, and were there when, the terrorist explosions went off. Through that evacuation, my friend Muhammad had 70 more family members, these other guys in the military, plus their families, plus, other people who were very close to them, also came to Spokane as part of those special immigrant visa process because of their direct ties, in some cases working in the military, or in other cases working for the United States in the U.S. Embassy. And that tees me up for framing the larger context of immigration. So we say that America oftentimes is referred to as a nation of immigrants. And so I did a little research, and there are about 8.75 million people who self-identify as American Indian or Alaskan Natives. So that's about 2.6% of the population. Now, some of those folks are not, exclusively Native or Indigenous, but they are at least partially Indigenous. So that means that 97.4% of the population of the United States does not identify as Indigenous, which means we're immigrants, or children or grandchildren of immigrants. And here in the Pacific Northwest, especially in the inland Northwest, this sort of Cheney, Spokane, Coeur d'Alene area, we have a relatively recent story of immigration. If you go back only a century and a half, 150 years is not that long ago. You go back to the era of the United States Civil War, there were very few non-Indigenous people living in this part of the country. And that's not that long ago. My story in this part of the country started in 1901 when my great-grandparents, Brewer Aner and Helma Eriksson, came on a boat from Piteå, Sweden, and ended up in Portland, Oregon. My great-grandmother, they weren't married at the time, but they knew each other. My great-grandmother came as an indentured servant, which meant that her boat fare was prepaid by a wealthy family in Portland so that she would work for them for several years as a household servant in order to pay off that debt. And so I think she had to work for 3 years in order to pay that off. But it happened that they were part of a wealthy family in Portland who had married into a wealthy family in Coeur d'Alene who was into the mining business or something. And so she got transferred and worked in Coeur d'Alene, and she and my great-grandfather spent their entire lives working. Eventually they got paid, but they lived on site and they worked as sort of the domestic help in this house in Coeur d'Alene for years. That's where my grandfather was born and grew up in a Swedish-speaking home and part of a Swedish-speaking church in Coeur d'Alene. That's not something we think about a lot because there's not a lot of Swedish-speaking churches or Swedish-speaking organizations. But at the time, there was a large wave of immigrants from Scandinavia and other parts, including Eastern Europe and Poland, sort of at the turn of the last century. Fun fact, because we're in a library, I'm going to give you a book recommendation. So if anybody likes books, you're all like, no, we just got through midterms. I do not need any more books in my life. But if you ever want one, a great read is called The Cold Millions by a local author named Jess Walter. He's a #1 New York Times bestseller. Great historical fiction based in real events around the turn of the last century about the dynamics in Spokane of the rise of the labor movement. But there's all kinds of interesting immigrant dynamics in there about folks who are Irish immigrants and Polish immigrants and Italians. There's a significant Asian Chinese population in this area 125 years ago that was working as labor on the railroads. There's this long migrant story, even in a very white place like eastern Washington, northern Idaho, that's easily forgotten because of our tendency as a society to whitewash our immigrant history. And I think that's a really important backdrop for what's happening right now, and including some of the discourse that we're hearing about us versus them, in particular on national levels around immigration. Now, that's nationally, but globally, we're in one of the largest migration movements of humans in the history of the world. Right now, arguably, there is more people moving from one place to another than any time on planet Earth. There's an organization that is a part of the United Nations called the International Organization for Migration, or known as IOM. And every year they release a report. In 2024, their World Migration Report said that as of the latest statistics, there are 281 million people who are migrants at the time. 281 million people. That's about 3.5% of the entire population of the planet. And to put that in perspective, if migrants, if people who are moving were all one country or one nationality, they would be tied for the 4th most populous country in the world. Indonesia also has 281 million people. The only 3 larger countries would be the United States, China, and India. More specifically, but that's all kinds of people moving for all kinds of reasons. It could be that you got a job to work in the technology sector in Taiwan, so you migrate over there. That's great. Or it could be that you did your education in India and got a job at Microsoft and came to Seattle to work in that Microsoft headquarters. That's migration. But it's not just that people are getting more opportunities or there's more mobility. A lot of this is forced migration, or people who are migrating because of a perceived struggle for survival. So the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, their most recent report about global trends said that there are 117 million people who are displaced by wars, violence, and persecution. Now, that number has been going up every year for the last 12 years. So 8 years ago when I started working with refugees, people were saying, hey, these numbers are higher than we've ever seen them. We're closing in on 70 million refugees in the world, which is just astronomical. That's more refugees than there were at the end of World War II. When Europe and Africa and Asia were decimated by war, we have more refugees in the world right now in 2016. We've almost doubled the number of refugees in the last 8 years across the planet. It's just astronomically huge how many more conflicts we're having. Now, some of the top countries of origin for refugees. What are some of the places, I'm going to give you guys a chance to talk for just a second. What are some of the places where we would expect refugees to be fleeing from? Just name some countries. Syria, yeah, what else? Sudan? South Sudan, the Congo, Venezuela, Ukraine. Right, and a couple other ones. So Haiti is another place where there's a lot of people trying to get out of there. Myanmar traditionally is a place that has produced lots and lots of refugees. They've actually been in a state of ongoing civil war since the mid-1940s at the end of World War II. The Western colonial powers that sort of sliced and diced up the map and just gave things away. made some bad choices in a lot of places, but Myanmar is one of the worst because there's 12 ethnic groups that all got lumped into one chunk on the map, and the power was given to one ethnic group who's been, whether through, in some cases, genocide, in other cases, various kinds of military tactics, has been trying to take over the territory of these other rival groups for 60 some odd years. Lots of refugees from there. And then increasingly we're seeing that the present conflict with Israel, Palestine, Gaza is overspilling. Over 1 million people have been displaced in Lebanon. Now, the Palestinians living in Gaza can't be refugees because they're not actually allowed out of Gaza, which is its own kind of tragedy, but they're not migrants because they can't leave. But for Lebanon, there's a million Lebanese that just in the past few months have been displaced within their own country. Lots and lots of things are causing people to want to move, and this is to say nothing of places that are peaceful but very difficult and oppressive places. So North Korea and Pakistan and Iran are also places where some folks don't feel comfortable staying, even if there's not an actual active war. Now, there's these push factors. Those are push factors for migration, things that push people to leave. Another push factor that causes people to want to leave is oppression or repression or limitation of rights. Recent reporting by NPR and the Associated Press has documented the things that have happened specifically about oppressing women's rights in Afghanistan. And I don't know how much you've all read about this, but systematically since the Taliban took over the country, women's rights are being restricted more and more and more. At first it was that women couldn't go out in public. Then it was that women had to cover their entire faces all the time. More recent iterations of the oppression include that women are not allowed to go to school after 6th grade at all. So no universities, no middle school, no high school for any women in the country. All public spaces, including national parks and local city parks, women are not allowed in the parks at all. And just in the last few weeks, a new rule was ruled out that said that women cannot talk to each other, and that inside of their homes, women have to talk in quiet voices because if they talk loud enough that somebody could potentially hear them through an open window or in an adjoining apartment, that would be deemed illegal. So there's a lot of reasons why people feel these push factors to leave the places they're leaving, and it motivates migration. Even though immigration is not easy, it's very challenging for lots of reasons, these are some of the main motivations that cause people to leave. Now, there's also pull factors, right? So when somebody says, I just got to get out of here, they get out of there, but they got to figure out, where am I going to go, right? And the United States is often the top of people's lists, but it's not the only destination. There's many, many other countries across the world that are receiving lots more migrants than they generate. But one of the pull factors, in addition to sort of safety and freedom, is economic opportunity. So countries that have jobs available, strong currencies, and the ability to make a living wage or to have a growing career. Does anybody remember the recession that we were going to have a year and a half ago? You remember how we were all going to go in recession and it was going to be terrible? And a lot of that was because of inflation, right? So we had this high inflation, and when you have high inflation, recession is going to happen almost for sure, right? So there was this period of about 6 months, I think it was about a year and a half ago in the spring, where everybody was saying, this kind of inflation is not sustainable, we're going to have a recession, it's going to be really bad, and then it never happened. So in July, back in, I think it was February, there's a group in Washington, D.C. called the Congressional Budget Office. And the CBO is nonpartisan, they're not involved in any political anything. They're just a bunch of people probably down in a basement who love to crunch numbers on spreadsheets. And their job was, how do we understand this? Because there was these sort of hints that maybe migration or immigration was related to some of our economics. So they released a report, and they said that one of the major factors of why the U.S. averted a recession is that we've had high immigration numbers the last 2 years. And so with more immigrants coming to fill those lower level jobs, we were able to keep our economy exceedingly strong despite the pressures of inflation, which was a shock to a lot of people. It's also important to note that a lot of immigrants, when they choose to travel to a new place, are in their younger years. So it tends to skew towards people immigrating when they're at their sort of peak productive years, or the early half or early third of their career years, whereas the U.S. population and a lot of other developed countries in Europe or Japan, for example, Low birth rates and older populations means that there's a lot of gaps in the workforce. There's not a lot of Americans who are just clamoring to get that, that minimum wage job at Taco Bell or go clean rooms downtown at the hotels in Spokane, which means there's gaps in those industries. There's people who will pay the money for the services, but we've got a gap in the labor market. Those are great jobs for folks who have a reason to come here for safety, security, or economic opportunity. All right, I'm going to talk about the role of government in immigration, but first I want to tell you one more story. And I'm going to tell you a story about two people called Patricia and Samba. And these are folks that I met a number of years ago. They are from a small West African country. They came here because they were actually part of an elite family that was very high up in politics and society in the country that they came from. Brother and sister. And their dad was actually a cabinet-level member on a presidential administration in the country they came from. So their dad was secretary of something or other, and through his many years there, they also grew up in diplomacy, and they had posts in government. Well, there was an election, and the ruling party was outvoted, and a new party came to power. And immediately, even though this country didn't have a history of this kind of violence, neighboring countries did, immediately they started to see people who were associated with the former government being disappeared. So Patricia was in the country at the time and got on a plane and got out of there immediately. Samba was overseas on a diplomatic mission somewhere else in Asia and never went back. So they figured out a bunch of things and lived in third countries, and eventually they made it through the U.S. resettlement program because they had a friend here in Spokane or a family member, and they ended up being resettled to Spokane. Samba had recently married and had a pregnant wife who is still back in that country, or at this point, I'm not sure, I haven't talked to him recently. She may be in another country, but he's still waiting for her to get here, and he has a daughter that he's never met. This is another example of ways that, I never thought that we had, high-level government officials coming here and showing it up in our community, but that's another example of a family that's affected by migration. Now, here's some thoughts on the role of government in immigration, because for many voters, especially in this last election we just had a week or so ago, immigration was in their number one category, or at least in the top three. It was also, the Republican Party won a majority in the Senate as well as the presidency and probably going to win the House. If you look at their policy platform on their website, immigration is right at the top. It's a key piece of what they're talking about in terms of their policy goals. Now, there is important roles of governments to engage in immigration. And I'll just name a couple of them, three in particular. One is the role of government in immigration is also is related to international law. There are treaties and organizations that the United States and many, many other countries participate in that are related to immigration. And in my organization, we work largely with humanitarian immigrants, so refugees or people seeking asylum or fleeing wars. And we're particularly interested in the government's role in participating in these international treaties and rules. Back in, let me just check my notes. Okay, in 1939 was sort of the run-up to World War II, and we saw this growing influence of the Nazi Party in Europe. There were a lot of people trying to get out of Europe at the time because they felt like it wasn't safe or they were being targeted, particularly Jewish people. One of the most tragic incidents that happened before the war actually involved the United States was a group called the a ship called the MS St. Louis that came to the United States with 937 passengers. Many of them were Jews who felt unsafe and were trying to request safety in the United States. The ship came to Miami, was held offshore for quite some time, and the people were not allowed entry. They went to other places. I believe they tried to get into Cuba as well. Eventually, the ship was sent all the way back to Germany, and more than 300 of those passengers were Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. When stories like that came to light after the end of the war, not only was the Holocaust a terrible thing, but that our own immigration policies contributed to unnecessary suffering and death and trauma. That was part of the reason that some of the international laws were put into effect through the United Nations and the League of Nations and other groups that created things like international asylum law. which says if somebody comes to your country and says that they don't feel safe returning, you at least have to give them the opportunity to present their case before you send them back, which is a system that we see affecting a lot of people at our southern border. They come here saying it's not safe for me to go back to Venezuela. Our government says, okay, well, we can't deport you until we give you a trial and verify that claim or dispute it. So there's international laws like that that our government has a role in ensuring that we're compliant with. A second area is that we have to ensure the safety of our own country from external security threats or crime. There is a role for governments to control migration because there is a primary purpose in establishing the safety and security of the people. So, for example, one of the main agencies that we rely on here in the United States is called Customs and Border Patrol, or Customs and Border Protection. And it's a group that patrols all the border crossings, that works to stop human trafficking and drug trafficking and transnational cartels. And they're a group that I've actually had a chance to work with in a number of situations because even though it's not nearly as publicized and it's not nearly as big, there are sometimes people who come across the northern border and request asylum from Canada. So mostly not Canadians, other groups, but that's how they come to access the country. So there is a role for government in establishing those norms and regulating things. The third role is to consider the impact on the larger society. And I think in America, sometimes it's public health, and we saw drastic changes to immigration policy at the government level during the COVID pandemic, for example, where we had lockdowns and we had immigration freezes. But usually in normal times, it has more to do with the economics. Really, it's the government's role to decide how many immigrants do we need for our workforce and at what levels. Little footnote here, many people have advocated for immigration reform in the United States because the last time that we had our immigration policy significantly updated was 1965. Raise your hand if you were born before 1965. Anybody in this room? Yes, we got one. Yes, we got one. So, we got two people. So, there's only two people alive in this room that were in existence the last time the United States upgraded our immigration policy. And we're talking like before the internet, we're talking like before color television. I mean, you think your iPhone needs to be updated like every few months, right? You'd think our immigration policies could use an upgrade too. So that's one of the challenges that we're facing right now is that in our own government, we have some very outdated policies that haven't caught up, and particularly that has to do with the economic situation. That we have millions of jobs that need to be filled, but the number of visas we give out for those jobs is very, very small and based on data from half a century ago. So these are some of the factors, and that's some of the role that the government has in immigration. All right, I want to get to my point here at the last piece of what is the role of local communities in immigration, but I want to tell you one more story before we do it. I want to tell you about a dad named Emmanuel. And he is originally Congolese, but lived in a refugee camp in Malawi for 17 years with his kids and his wife. His wife died a few years before he came to the United States. So when he came with his 7 kids. About 2 or 3 of them were sort of young adults, and then they kind of went down to the youngest was about 6 when they got here. In addition to my day job working at Thrive International, I'm also a part-time pastor at a small church in Spokane. And so when this family came, it was during a heightened period of a lot of immigrants coming. And so the local resettlement agency had said, hey, we don't actually have enough room, especially for larger families. You put 8 people, you can't put them in a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment. You need like a house or something. And it's very hard to find that for brand new folks who don't have a credit history or a rental history or an income already. So our church had a big space down in the basement and a kitchen and a bathroom. And we said, hey, let them live with us. So for 4 months, we had Emmanuel and his family living in our church basement. We didn't know anything about him before they got here, but it turned out that he was a pastor in a church in Malawi. And so they kind of like hung out with us on Sunday mornings, which was super fun. And then after about a year, Dad ends up saying, hey, you know what? This is great. They moved on and got their own apartment once the dad and the older 3 kids started working, and they were just fine. He said, hey, we love the church. Can we start a Swahili church? I was like, yeah, great. What time do you want to meet? He's like, well, I work in the mornings usually, so how about 4 o'clock Sunday evening? So They now started a Swahili church, and the Swahili church has more people than the English church does in the morning. And they've just done really well. They've worked hard. Several of their kids, one of their kids was like student of the year at North Central High School for academic achievement. They recently bought a house, so they have their own home. Even though they've lived in the country for only 3 years, they've generated enough money to buy their own home. They're just a phenomenal group of people making a really big impact in the community. And I wanted to use that especially as the launching point into this last section about the role of the local community in engaging immigration. And the first thing I want to say is that everyone lives and works in a local community. There's no generic humans, just like there's no generic migrants, because every one of us is so based in place and relationship. And even though immigration is this large national policy issue, and there is a role for government policy, every one of those immigrants or asylum seekers or undocumented people or illegals, as some folks refer to people who are here without papers or permission, they live in a place. Like they're all in a geographic location, longitude and latitude right now, just like each of us is. We're located in a chair or a spot or a university. We have a town and a community. And that's part of what it means to be human. But it also means that as folks are displaced from one place, they got to end up somewhere else. And that's where we have to think about the places that we have. And what if some of those folks ended up in my place? Now, NIMBY, you probably know the term NIMBY, not in my backyard. NIMBYism is a big thing. I don't care where that problem or person exists, as long as it's not in my space. But in a time where we have the most massive migration of people, probably in human history, there's got to be spaces somewhere. And unfortunately, a lot of the spaces that are being inhabited by migrants right now are not sustainable, not safe, and functioning to further destabilize other countries and communities. Give you an example. About 6 years ago, I traveled to Bangladesh, which is next to Myanmar. And this was about 6 months after a big wave of Rohingya people had left Bangladesh and were living in this huge network of encampments. It's called a refugee camp, but it's a city 3 times the size of Spokane. There's 1 million people living there in tents that just sprawl for miles. And I had a chance to go there and interact with some folks. Now, I don't speak the Rohingya language very well, but occasionally I was able to work through an interpreter. There's people from all walks of life who are there. Doctors, teachers, farmers, all kinds of folks. But when they're stuck in this camp, they're not allowed to work in their host country. So they're dependent on aid from the World Food Program and nonprofits from around the world. Now, it's good that people are providing aid for these folks, but there's such a huge need there. Most of the time, as I've followed it through the last few years, most of the time the UN and other agencies say they have less than 50% of the resources they need to actually sustain people. There's not enough medicine, there's not enough schools, there's not enough food, there's not enough tents, there's not enough fuel. People are just barely hanging on to survival. It is the most colossal waste of human potential I've ever seen in my life. There is 1 million people who could be farming and growing food. They could be educating young people. They could be getting educated themselves and joining into the technology fields or the medical fields where we desperately need solutions to great crises that we're facing in the world. And we're wasting the human potential of tens of millions of people around the world right now, because there's not enough of us who are willing to share our place with somebody else who needs one. And so we're pushing them into these places and spaces where they can't be productive. And the foundational assumption that I have is that humans are meant to be generative, right? We're not, I would not go in the full Darwinian sense of like, we're just here to survive and survival of the fittest. I would say, what about the most generativity? Like, humans aren't meant to just make enough money to pay your bills. I think that we are here to make something that contributes to the flourishing of other people, whether that's art or music or science or food or whatever it is. We all can make a contribution, and that's where the deepest meaning is in our lives, when we can uniquely do things and create things that the rest of the world can benefit from. We're wasting that in tremendous quantities right now. 3.6% of the world's population are refugees. That's 100 million people plus that could be contributing to helping us address challenges like climate change or increasing partisanship in the world, and we are letting these folks go to waste. So that's the problem. Thus, we need to be involved as local communities in creating those spaces. So there's a few things I want to just throw out there, and then we'll have a chance for a few questions. So informing and advocating for improved immigration policy is very important. Did you know that you could get a meeting with a representative in the U.S. government? We just elected a guy named Michael Baumgartner. If anybody wants to meet with Michael Baumgartner, you can do that. You can get a group of students and say, hey, we care about a certain issue and we want to request a meeting with our representative. You might not get a chance to meet him personally, although you might. You definitely can meet with his staff members, including his policy advisors on a specific issue. So if you care about immigration, you care about higher education, you care about environmental issues, you can meet with our representatives. It's insane. I've taken folks who are immigrants from other countries and they're like, I don't understand how this just happened, because in our country there's no way you could ever meet with a member of parliament. But you guys can just walk into their office and set up a meeting and talk to them. It's true. So that's part of the reason that we need to recognize that local communities, we have a tremendous amount of power on policy issues. That's one way that local communities can be involved in migration. Second, each local community has ways in which immigration intersects with the community in unique ways. One of the ways here that it intersects in this area is immigration intersects in some interesting ways with the changes in our economic makeup. So the first wave of immigrants that included my great-grandparents was the sort of rapid industrialization of this area, particularly around the growth of agriculture, lots of farming as it developed. My great-grandpa on the other side owned the first tractor dealership in the inland Northwest. He sold the first Fordson tractors in the Palouse. So there's this growth in agriculture, the timber industry as logging became this big widespread industry, and mining. That was the big economic wave that drove tens of thousands of immigrants here about 100 or 150 years ago. But we've seen a big shift from industrialization and that agricultural-based work to other kinds of things like tourism and hospitality. That's also part of the economic driver of why we need more folks in some jobs. Hospitality jobs are hard work. They're long hours. They don't give you holidays off. Oftentimes you're working overnight to clean hotel rooms. Very, very hard to find folks born in this community who want those jobs. But our larger economy depends on those. So that's a key place where we can be involved in engaging and advocating for immigration by connecting with those local business sectors. There's a lot of employers that love hiring immigrants. I think there's another piece of it that's really important here, and that this is, I may be wrong, so you can disagree with me on this one. I don't have a lot of research on this. This is just my own sense. I think we're in the midst of a shift from a national value of sort of moral leadership regarding refugees and humanitarian issues to much more state, regional, and local leadership on a lot of these issues. If America is going to be a place that stands with refugees, like the poem on the Statue of Liberty that says, "Give me your tired and your poor and your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," or one of the songs I grew up with, I'm going to totally date myself here, Neil Diamond's song, "They're coming to America." I feel like I need like a big collar or something when I do that. If we're going to maintain a connection to those values, at least in the next 4 years with the current administration, it's going to have to be something that we embrace at a local level. We can't cede that to our government and say, hey, you're in charge of immigration, like I hope it matters to you. We're going to have to say, you know what? We're going to create spaces here that demonstrate the value of immigrants. Now, those values are, I think, pieces like religious freedom, freedom of thought and expression, multiculturalism, and strong work ethics and high levels of entrepreneurial motivation. We have competing storylines, and yes, we can argue with our friends about politics and our families and things like that, but really, how do we demonstrate it? If we want, give you a very clear example. Thanksgiving is coming up in a couple of weeks. You all get a few days off of class, and I'm sure that's really nice, and I'm sorry if you have to work on papers the whole time. Thanksgiving is one of those storylines that's deep in American history. We have the slavery and oppression immigration storyline that runs very deep. We also have this incredible multicultural hospitality storyline that goes back to this Thanksgiving story. And it may be embellished in some ways, but there's also some significant truth there to the fact that we've always been a nation where there's hospitality extended to the newest arrivals. You have a chance to make a difference with that. Hang out with an international student and have a Friendsgiving. Even if you just go to the cafeteria together and that's all you can do, recreate that storyline and reinvest in that storyline at a local level in a local place, because that's how the world turns. We've gotten so much emphasis lately on the power of politics from the top down. Sometimes we forget that democracy is based on power from the bottom up. Can anybody name the president who campaigned on civil rights in America? Who said, if you elect me, I'll champion civil rights and I'll make sure that black people have the right to vote? What president campaigned on that? Nobody did. No president ever campaigned on that. We don't have civil rights in the United States because a president campaigned on it or because the Senate got flipped to the pro-civil rights party. We have that kind of rights and freedom in this country because there was a grassroots movement that forced change all the way through the top. The same reason that you women can vote. It wasn't because there was a bunch of men that said, we think this is a great idea, and if you vote us in, we'll let you. It was a sustained effort from the grassroots level where women challenged the values that this country was made on until they got the rights that they deserved. The same is true today, in particular with immigrants. The last thing I'll point out is that there's a role here for faith communities. And I don't have any idea how many or if any of you are part of faith communities, but I will point out that faith communities are almost always the first self-organized communities of immigrants in any community. And I've seen this all over the world. The same is true with my great-grandparents who were part of the Swedish church in Idaho. And the same is true with the Swahili congregation that's meeting in my building where I pastor a church on Sunday afternoons. Faith communities are important. And faith communities are important because there's a shared value that transcends cultures. They're also very important because the values of welcome and hospitality are deeply embedded in many faith traditions. And so I'm a Christian, and deep in the Christian tradition, there's stories of all the great Christian leaders were immigrants. Abraham was an immigrant. Moses was an immigrant. The whole Exodus story is an immigrant story. Jesus had to flee persecution when he was first born. His parents took him and raised him in Egypt as a refugee kid because of the dangers, and he went through that immigrant journey. Like, there's huge amounts of immigrant DNA in the Christian tradition, in the Jewish tradition, in the Muslim tradition. The Latter-day Saints, I don't know if we have any Latter-day Saints in the room, but there's a huge emphasis in the LDS community as well about valuing refugees and hospitality because of their own experience of persecution. These, I think, are really important resources. So if you're part of a faith community, I'd invite you to engage with your leadership and say, hey, in this time, I'd love it if our faith community could be engaged with immigration and refugees and international students here at Eastern Washington University. So let me conclude, and then hopefully we can have a few questions. I don't know how long this thing goes. You're all here till 5, right? Okay. All right, let me just say this. Ultimately, mass migration presents an important opportunity for local communities to choose what kind of values we want to embody and what kind of future we want to create for ourselves, both long-term and short-term, by how we want to respond to the global migration crisis. Now, there is an important policy dimension to immigration that does require looking at immigration from a broad perspective. However, only by embracing the specifics of individual families in particular communities will the world gain traction with the challenge of mass migration and reap the benefits of some of the most talented, motivated people in the world seeking new opportunities to thrive by coming to our neighborhoods. Thank you. And if there's anybody wants to ask a question or two, I think we have some time, but I want to thank you so much for your attention today. And if you got to run to class or something, I am deeply offended that you're getting up right now. Just kidding. Thanks. If you're interested in learning more, thriveinternational.org. You can learn more about what we do. There's also some brochures floating around. But for those who want to stay and ask questions,
I'll pass it to you.
I'm happy to chat.
Oh.
Yep.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to mention that my name is Pamela Thuswaldner. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator at Thrive International. Thank you for being here. And before you head off to class, I just wanted to mention that this Saturday from 2 to 6, Thrive International is having a gratitude open house. So if you're interested in learning more about our programs, meeting the program coordinators, please stop by this Saturday from 2 to 6. How many have plans this Saturday already?
Oh, you're roped in now. You're committed.
All right. I hope to see some of you come out to the Thrive Center downtown this Saturday.
I'm hoping that some students are still sticking around for this question because I think it would be really interesting for them to learn about how you got to where you are. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became a social worker? Yes.
Oh my gosh.
And a little bit more about that because I think that's really important to know.
Yeah, so I did a degree in communication, so like journalism and public speaking. Went to Whitworth University and never really knew what I wanted to do when I grew up. So I went down the road of actually, I was inclined towards a helping profession, and so I went down the road towards ministry. I worked for a couple years part-time in a church downtown in Spokane, and then went to seminary, got a master's degree in theology, and thought that I was going to be a full-time pastor. But life just never opened the door for me. I always ended up, working at Starbucks or working in administration at a seminary and never actually getting a full-time paycheck from a church. And so even though I kept trying to go down that route, I've always just kind of found that the opportunities for me just keep evolving in this realm of working as a social worker type person. But I also have a strong leadership streak. So I'm a visionary and I'm an organizer. I'm a good team builder. And so as I got this opportunity to lead in the context of the Refugee Resettlement Office, I had a chance to see some ways that I might be able to use my entrepreneurial abilities in a way that created more and better structures to serve immigrants, which has become a passion and a calling for me. So it's been not exactly a straight line vocationally. I went from my college degree to a part-time ministry job to another part-time ministry job to living overseas volunteering for ministry in Thailand for a year to working at Starbucks for 3 years during the recession to seminary, basically grad school project administrator for 4 years to very short stint as I'm going to start a new church in Spokane to social worker, refugee resettlement director, new nonprofit leader. So I don't know if there's a formula for that, but that's kind of what happened to me. I think the most important thing that I did is in looking at like my educational journey, I did, bachelor's, master's, PhD. The most important choices I made were based on what is going to help me grow the most as a person and maximize the strengths that I know that I have. So, I love communication, majored in that because I didn't know where that would go directly, but I knew that I was good at it and I want to get better at it. Same for ministry and theology, and then when I did my PhD work, it was also around communication work and framing narratives. So, yeah, I'm happy to have coffee or lunch with people who want the full story.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned about how immigration reform kind of stopped in the 60s, but this is only half of the story because not only we just stopped there, also there has been movement of backward movements. There was a lot of backlash in immigration laws starting in the 90s, and sometimes people thought it would just be, it started at the last Trump administration. Actually, it went way, way, way more than that.
Right.
And I think part of it why also, state level advocacy work has become much more important because I was involved with a statewide coalition of Asian American and Pacific Islander. They started during the 90s when Clinton's welfare reform cut off a lot of public assistance for immigrants. And so they started to organize, going to Olympia, en masse, and pushing, the state of Washington to step up to cover some of the gaps in the loss of public assistance.
Right.
So one thing that I worry about, and we have seen in the last Trump administration, is making it even harder for immigrants and refugees to get government assistance. And so can you talk about what you may anticipate or worry that it would happen, and what would be the specific kind of things that people here can advocate at the state level also?
Yeah, I think that's a great setup. I'll try to keep this brief because I could go for another hour on all of that stuff. The new administration has said very explicitly that they are going to be extremely harsh against immigration. So they have said they're going to end the refugee resettlement program. They said they're going to try to deport millions of people, which I think logistically and financially is probably impossible, but it wouldn't surprise me if they try to do things that visibly look dramatic so that they can say they're fulfilling those promises. And I expect that we'll see a lot of cuts to any sort of federally funded programs that support immigrants and immigration, because that's been explicit for the last 2 years of campaigning. The state of Washington does rely on some federal funding to fund some of their programs, but not all. So advocacy at the state level is very important, especially in a state that is very pro-immigrant. You know, Washington has been at the leading edge of receiving refugees from the time of, before the modern refugee resettlement program in the 1970s with Vietnamese immigrants. About 40% of the city of Seattle is foreign-born, which is very high numbers compared to the United States, where the average is nationwide probably about 14. Yeah. So we're in a very immigrant-friendly state, and I think that advocacy is very important because the state's got, they've only got so many dollars, and there's plenty of people who want them. So advocacy specifically for immigrants is important as we see federal support going down. What was the other piece you said? There was one other thing.
What might be the other things that you anticipate would happen?
Yes. Okay, other things. And I think this really speaks to why it's so important, like locally and individually. The government's not going to solve problems at the larger scale immigration because they've been kicking the can down the road for a long, long time. Most of us probably don't remember this, but when George Bush Jr. ran for election, one of his main points in 2000, this is 24 years ago, one of his main campaign platform issues was immigration reform. We have got to fix our immigration system. Well, 9/11 happens, less than a year after he takes office, and all of a sudden now it's the war on terror, and we never got to immigration reform. Obama campaigns on immigration reform, couldn't get it done. Now, with the Trump administration, we're not going to talk about reforming immigration. We're just going to be very punitive in our approach because that is attractive to people, but it's not very functional. And because of that punitive rhetoric, we've seen both parties take a much harsher stand on immigration. The Biden administration looked an awful lot like the Trump administration when you look at the southern border. They didn't pull back Title 42, even though the pandemic was pretty much over everywhere else, for like a year. They kept those lockdowns in place. And even some of the things that are keeping the border numbers low right now look very much like the Trump administration did. So we've got kind of a bipartisan commitment to try and stop immigration through these channels that are both very expensive and not very efficient. And I think that on the local level, what we want to do is keep working in our own communities and at our state. In 4 years, if red states that are super anti-immigrant and ship out their immigrants, I want to see the economic data on how well Texas does versus Washington in 4 years. And I think that the proof is going to be in the pudding. Now, I also think it's important that we recognize that there's a moral imperative and a human value that's not just about economics. We can't just say, well, refugees are good for the economy, so we should let them in. That's a good byproduct, but we need to say America's about freedom. And we're about giving people human rights and dignity, and we need to support folks who are champions for those things internationally by giving them safe harbor here. They also start businesses at twice the rate of American-born people and fill in important jobs, so that's good too. But it can't just be about economics. I will say one more thing, and I'm sorry, I know I'm talking a lot. Historically, it's very important to locate this moment in the wider scope of American history. If you go back to the 1920s, we see, so a century ago, we see very similar rhetoric. We see a rise of nationalism all across the world. We see tons of anti-immigrant rhetoric and anti-immigrant policies. We've had a lot of issues in this country, not just in the 20s, but even in earlier phases, where we have become very inward focused, very hostile towards immigrants, and villainized people who perceive to be different. my last name is an Irish name, and I have a Swedish half of my family and an Irish half of my family. And 150 years ago, when there was hordes of Irish people coming in, it was all the same things we're hearing right now about people from the South. They have diseases, they're high on crime, they're not well educated, they're changing our culture, they're taking our jobs, it costs too much money. Like all of the same tropes were exactly, you can go look at the newspaper articles and the politicians' speeches, it's the same set of arguments, but now we don't remember it because Irish people are white and so it didn't count anymore, right? So I think we need to recognize, one, that we've been here before and that this is a dark thread of American identity and history. But two, it didn't stick last time because there's some key flaws in that rhetoric and that storyline. It's not actually sustainable and there's pieces of it that aren't true. And so you can only sustain a false narrative so long before the forces of the economy and other things force you to go back into a direction that's based more in reality. So I do think that we will see the pendulum swing back. But this is not the first time the pendulum has swung here. And part of what I hope I can contribute to is, helping it stop and swing the right direction by pointing out that there's a deeper and truer story that involves embracing diversity and that involves giving folks the right to live and join our country who share our values, regardless of the differences that they might have or the places they might come from. Other thoughts, questions?
As both a minister and a social worker, your jobs must be terribly emotionally challenging. So how do you combat empathy fatigue?
Ooh, that's a good one. So this week has been pretty rough because a lot of my coworkers are people who are like themselves immigrants. Like we have about 6 people on our staff who are Ukrainians. And many of them only have a temporary status. They got allowed to be here for 2 years, they got renewed for 2 years, but it's really up to the president to determine if that gets renewed or not. So folks are like, hey, I'm from the city of Mariupol, which is now both bombed into a gravel pit and in Russian territory. I can't go back. Like, what am I going to do if my legal status ends? So there's been a lot of emotional conversations, and I think I'm married to a therapist, so that helps. I get free therapy all the time. But from an emotional perspective, I think recognizing that there's a lot of people just who are grieving right now, and rather than saying, here's what we're going to do to fix it, the best thing to do when you're in a state of grief or shock is to just be present to each other. And so if there's those of you who are really suffering still, like find a friend and just hang out, be present, grieve, cry, don't try to solve it. You just have to let your emotional process work through. I've also given myself permission this week to just eat a lot of comfort food. Like, I'm just going to take care of myself. I'm going to sleep a little bit more. If I don't feel like getting up in the morning, I'm going to just sleep in, and I'm going to eat a bunch of yummy food that makes me feel better. So I've had more donuts this week than I have most weeks ever, and that's okay. But I think on the longer term perspective, it's important to make sure you take your vacations, that you hold your boundaries, and you don't work more than you're supposed to. And one piece, we could talk more about this one, is recognizing that people don't need you as much as you want them to sometimes. Or another way of putting that is people will need you as much as you let them need you. So if great example, very simple, is as we're working with refugees and immigrants, a lot of times they need rides to places because they don't have a car. The first time, great, give them a ride. The second time, show them a map on the bus and make sure they have the app on their phone, but don't keep giving people rides to places. Yes, it sucks to take an hour to get somewhere on the bus when you could get there in 20 minutes in a car. But really, that extra effort is creating an enabling relationship when really they need an empowering relationship. And so those kind of boundaries are honestly better for the folks that we're trying to serve, but also a way of preserving your own ability to stay sane and not get burned out.
We can take one more question. Yes.
Is there some way to volunteer where you?
We do not take volunteers, and we don't take financial donations, and we don't want you to Google us or join our Facebook page. But if you wanted to, it's at thriveinternational.org, and we have some brochures and stuff here. We would love, love, love to have you come volunteer with us. We're hoping to ramp up and have some internship programs and things like that too. So the one story I didn't share because I ran out of time was about a dear friend of mine that I worked with for a number of years who came as a refugee and whose mom was present in the 90s for the genocide that happened in Rwanda. And she grew up here. She's a social worker now. Got both her bachelor's and her master's degree here at Eastern Washington University. So appreciate you Eagles and the ways that you're part of helping our community be a vibrant, welcoming, multicultural community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Finney, and please.
My pleasure. Thank you.